Welcome to the 2021 DPS Deathmatch, a brutal tournament where DPS specs are going to be pit against each other and analyzed in what they do best or what they do worst, and then eventually only one of them will reign. This side of the bracket will see the melee DPS going against each other, one after the next. And for today, we are starting with a triple threat cage match between seed number 2 of all the melee DPS, Havoc Demon Hunter, seed number 5 of the entirety of the DPS roster, put against Windwalker Monk, seed number 5 of the melee DPS and seed number 14 of all the DPS specs. Lastly, the outsider, the possible underdog, Frost Death Knight, seed number 11 of melee DPS and seed number 21, with all of the DPS counted. So before we go into any more detail, we have to look at exactly how did these specs get here, in which state have they gotten into this tournament. So Havoc has gotten on a rise compared to before. They weren't very fit coming up before this competition. Not many people were giving them much credit, but then they were given a rejuvenating lift thanks to a super secret training given to them at Blizzard HQ. Many people have accused Havoc of colluding with Blizzard, of being in some sort of preferential treatment with the referees of this tournament, often being bailed out from bad situations by Blizzard, but what is certain is that they have gotten up to this point in a buffed situation. What puts Havoc as one of the favorites in the bracket for melee DPS is the fact that they are able to differentiate the type of damage they want to do, if they want to focus more on single target or if they want to focus more on AoE. This of course has much higher value on the raid category of the competition, because of course in Mythic Plus you are locked in a single spec for the entire run, as opposed to raid encounters where you can just pick and choose whichever suits you best by each boss. Demon Hunters can go for this build, which is the more single target oriented build. You take Essence Break, you take Momentum, you ditch all of the synergy centered around I-Beam to go for a much more consistent single target damage, or you can go for the other build, which is of course much more AoE oriented, because you take Blind Fury and you take Cycle of Hatred, both of which are going to synergize with your I-Beam, so you want to have much more uptime on your I-Beam for better and more consistent AoE damage. This, for example, is your average Demon Hunter with the extra cooldown reduction on I-Beam, despite the fact that I-Beam has a 30-second cooldown. Here, in 90 seconds, you can use I-Beam 5 times, for example. And this is bound to free them up for some pretty good high finisher in this tournament, because depending on the boss, depending on the type of the competition, whether it's more single target or AoE focused, they can tinker with their talent setup. Now, on the other hand, when we go to one of the other competitors in this first match, Windwalker has not been historically known for being very varied and diverse when it comes to choices in their talent tree, and this new competition in the Sanctum of Domination Stadium is no less. Because after months and months of Shadowlands, the only difference remains pretty much: are you fighting more than one target for often enough? If the answer is yes, you take Dance of Chiji for more AoE damage. If you're not fighting more than one target for often enough, then you go take Hit Combo, which is basically just more of your normal mastery. The rest of the talent tree for Windwalker does not really change. What has changed, on the other hand, more importantly for Windwalker, is their Covenant, because up to a certain point, Windwalker was almost exclusively, by a large margin, they were playing Kyrian. Windwalker has very good synergy with their Covenant ability for Kyrian, Weapons of Order, but recently there has been a switch towards Bone Dust Brew. The difference, one of the main, effective tools for playing Necrolord as a Windwalker monk, is that Bone Dust Brew has a much shorter cooldown than Weapons of Order, and by much, I mean half. Instead of a 2-minute cooldown, it's a 1-minute cooldown. The reason why this is good is because this allows you to pretty much pair every single Bone Dust Brew together with one of your two Storm, Earth and Fire charges. So you will always have something to put on top of your Bone Dust Brew. And then, of course, every other Bone Dust Brew, you will have access to Invoke Xuen, your other 2-minute cooldown. This plays out very nicely. It plays out nicely in Mythic Plus, where 1-minute pulls, needing cooldowns every 1 minute is very, very standard, and also in several of the raid encounters that we will see that have pretty high burst necessities every minute or so, which makes it very good for Bone Dust Brew. This is pretty much the only major change happening to Windwalker. None of the other parts of their toolkit have changed, not even their legendary, pretty much nothing. Lastly, we have the underdog, which is Frost DK. Frost DK is both an underdog overall and also within its own class. Frost DK is some 6 to 7 times less played than Unholy. However, it has been picked into this bracket due to some more similarities with the rest of the specs being put here, and also because Unholy has too much of a high seed to be put next to Havoc. Now, with all the sadness in the world, you look at this talent tree and you're like, okay, this is how Frost DK plays now. Then you look at this talent tree and this is how it was playing, say, 6 months ago. Eisen, I'm sorry to interrupt. You put on the same picture twice? No, actually. Those are 2 different pictures relating to 2 different raid tiers months apart. The reason why they look the same is because they are the same, and because Frost DK has not changed in months. Which is sad, because before the expansion and right in the first weeks, there was excitement around DKs. Frost DK could have been a one-handed dual-wielding spec for more AoE and cleave, maybe a two-handed wielding obliterate-focused damage-dealing spec for single target. It still has multiple viable legendaries and possible avenues of play, and yet, after months and months, not really. We are back to playing Breath of Sindragosa, to playing pretty much the same spec you have been playing for a while now, so not really much has changed. Okay, once we have a solid background of all 3 specs, what is their damage profile? How are they performing in the raid? And where are they performing well or badly in the raid? When we look at the first boss, which is Eye of the Jailer, because of course Taragru doesn't count, you can immediately see why Havoc got its seed number 2 for melee DPS. Havoc, in a fight where it is going to be primarily single target with some 35-ish% of the time, the damage is going to be done to a secondary target close to the main one. You can see the major difference between Havoc and the other 2 specs. This is already setting up Havoc for being a stronger, lower target number type of spec. Whereas both Windwalker and Frost are doing mostly the same on lower targets. But at this point, there are still some excuses, some differences. When you think about it, it's not primarily single target, so maybe it's not that they are weak in single target, they simply don't have 2-target cleave. This can be a very weak point of several specs. Specs like Elemental, specs like Retribution Paladin have often had a glaring hole, a glaring weakness in being able to hit 2 targets equally, whereas other specs were very strong. Maybe this is what it's happening with Eye of the Jailer. Maybe it's just the fact that there is the second target that is sort of ruining things for Windwalker and Frost. Maybe Havoc, because they have Eye Beam, because they have Blade Dance, they can hit 2 targets at once, no problem. Immolation Aura, they even play with a legendary, which increases your Immolation Aura damage. So maybe that's the reason why. Now, the doubts can be reinforced when you go over to the 9. The 9 is a fight that for roughly 33-ish% of its duration is going to be 2 target, with a very short 3 target when the AD is spawning. After that, the last long part of the fight, it's just 1 boss left alive. That's how you want to play it out most of the time. So effectively, you're going to be having a 2-minute long 2-target cleave, and then something like a 3-minute and a half long pure single target. When we move over to this type of damage profile, Windwalker and Frost are still close to each other, but at the very least now Havoc is not that far ahead. They still remain in the solid lead in this competition. They are still holding on pretty tightly to their lead. Their damage on the high end is not that much higher than the other 2 specs. Windwalker top performances on this fight vary from 9.7 to 10.5 thousand DPS. Frost DK is between 9.6 and 10.3 thousand DPS, while Havoc is between 10.3 and 10.9. So they have the advantage, they are still performing better, but Frost and Windwalker are still keeping up. The first surprise, the first wrench in the plans of our seed number 2, Havoc Demon Hunter, is on Ner'zhul. Because Ner'zhul has a similar damage profile to the Eye of the Jailer, where at fixed intervals an extra target is going to pop up and can be damaged, but for the most part it's going to remain a single target. In here we see a very dramatic drop of Windwalker. When it becomes much more centered around single target, Windwalker is taking a drop off a cliff, but Frost Death Knight doesn't. Havoc remains high and remains at the top, whereas Windwalker is far below. What needs to be said about this big divide is that when you look at the top performers, this, for example, is Frost Death Knight. You can see that in the top 30 performers, they go from 9.1 to 7.5. Whereas when you go to Havoc, they go from 10 to 9.1. So basically, the 30th Havoc Demon Hunter on Ner'zhul is better than the first Frost Death Knight. So even though the average might be favoring, for the moment, Frost DK, we can see that the top performance when given the chance of Havoc Demon Hunter is much stronger. An asterisk to the performance of Havoc being passed by Frost also needs to be put because of the mechanic. The mechanic of having to pick up the orbs and throwing them down the platform is something that can often be assigned to a very fast spec like Havoc Demon Hunter, and pretty much never, you're trolling if you do, to a Frost Death Knight. So that can also explain why Havoc Demon Hunters can have such a large difference between the average and their top performers as opposed to Frost Death Knight. Something very important happens now, because now we have gone through the first bosses and we are yet to find AoE. We have dodged the Taragru, who still doesn't have AoE, the Eye doesn't really have AoE, the 9 doesn't really have AoE, Ner'zhul, nope. But now we enter Soul Render territory. Now Soul Render territory is going to look like a complete wash for Windwalker, because it looks as follows. It is probably one of the bigger gaps we're going to be seeing in this tournament, because Windwalker at the moment is far and away the best performing spec on Soul Render. It gets somewhat comical. The peaks, the top peaks of a Havoc Demon Hunter on Soul Render are around 14,000 DPS. For a Frost Death Knight are around 13,000 DPS, while the peaks of a Windwalker Monk are between 21 and 24,000 DPS on Soul Render. So this can tell us already that Havoc Demon Hunter seems to be performing nicely and very steadily when it comes to single target and low targets. 1 to 2, 1 to 2 to 3 targets. Havoc is doing very well. On single target, it seems like Windwalker is dropping off quite a bit, and in an opposite fashion, in AoE they are doing much better. What about Painsmith Raznal? Painsmith Raznal continues on the trend of AoE damage and less single target. This is possibly deceptive. There is literally something like 30 seconds of AoE in the entirety of the fight of Painsmith Raznal. And no one will tell you that AoE is very important on Painsmith Raznal, but that's what is going to be counted in the logs. These bad boys spawning twice in the encounter are going to have pretty much always the same HP you need to damage, which is 7.28 million. This means, considering the fight lasts some 7 minutes, there is about 17,000 DPS up for grabs in defeating these guys, and in the periods of high peaks, many specs can get to this DPS, which means eventually the overall damage will be much higher. And for a Windwalker Monk, it looks even higher. So Windwalker and Frost now are capitalizing on the AoE they can do on those ads, while Havoc is not really doing that much. It seems like a bizarro world where Havoc isn't doing as much AoE damage when they were known previously, particularly from their Mythic Plus renown in Legion and BFA for doing tons of AoE damage, but then again, so have Frost and Windwalker, and they have been known for that for a long time, and both Soul Render and Painsmith require very quick AoE damage. within 10 seconds or so. Now, we have established that when it comes to AoE, Windwalker is definitely the better of the specs. Frost is higher than Havoc, but not quite as high as Windwalker, whereas when it comes to lower targets, it's Havoc who is better. So now we have the final decider, which is Guardian of the Old Ones, because Guardian of the Old Ones doesn't even have any other targets, not even for a little while, like the Eye of the Jailer or like Ner'zhul. Guardian of the First Ones is entirely single target. And so it's going to look like this. Havoc has pretty much remained on a straight line for a while, whereas Windwalker and Frost, while growing, okay, they are certainly doing better, but they are still significantly behind Havoc, Demon Hunter. These type of advantages can be brought to a similar level in Mythic Plus as well, because the strength in AoE of both Windwalker and Frost is still going to show and is still going to be valuable in Mythic Plus keys, but as we have seen already from the raid, the consistent single target damage of Havoc Demon Hunter is what can give them an edge, and is what currently is making them the most represented Mythic Plus spec when it comes to melee DPS. It is a, you can say, a luxury, being able to be a spec that can change talents, and in some cases, more so for Mythic Plus, can change Legendary as well, to very starkly change the damage profile. This is not something that Windwalker Monk can do, for example, or Frost Death Knight either. Other specs can sort of do it by taking a much longer route. Rogues, for example, can just change spec. So, provided you have both legendaries, provided you can play different specs within the same covenant, you can do that as well. But it is a little bit more of an effort than what a Demon Hunter can get, just with a few talent swaps and a legendary swap. Unfortunately, when we want to go and look at other utility that might give the edge to some of the specs in here, unfortunately, even in that situation, the underdog of the competition won't really get that far ahead, because Demon Hunters and Monks are being gifted with Chaos Brand and Mystic Touch, so the 5% increase magical and physical damage taken that Havoc and Windwalker in this case can give. And talking about this case, Havoc even has an extra edge, because Brewmaster Monks are the most represented tanks, as opposed to Vengeance, which means there is simply a statistical higher chance of needing a Havoc Demon Hunter in your raid as opposed to needing a Windwalker Monk for your debuff, whereas there is no chance of needing a Death Knight in the raid. Anti-Magic Zone, which is what made it very, very good to have a Death Knight in the raid, is no longer needed as much since it has been nerfed. It is still somewhat good, not as good as before, but it can still be considered good if you're playing Blood, due to the HP increase a Blood DK can have, making AMZ more valuable, but not really for a Frost DK or an Unholy DK. Other utility is just going to be putting our poor underdog even further back. We already mentioned the variety of things at the disposal of a Demon Hunter, and they have Consume Magic as an offensive Magic Dispel and a ranged interrupt as a melee DPS. They have an AoE stun, they have access if they want to an invulnerability, they have Imprison for CC, they have extremely high mobility for a melee spec. Havoc has the double Fell Rush and the Vengeful Retreat, and even the Glide, the double jump glide, which can give you actually some usefulness in terms of dodging mechanics. Windwalker Monk doesn't have quite as much, but still has quite a few. They do have, for example, Paralyze, which is still good. They have Ring of Peace, which can also be a good CC tool. They have a stun, not quite as good as the AoE stun of the Havoc Demon Hunter, but still good. And again, while not as good and as fluid and easy to pull off movement abilities and buffs they can put on themselves, like the Havoc Demon Hunter, they still have pretty strong ones. Unfortunately, our Frost Death Knight doesn't really have nearly as much. Talking about the nerfed AMZ, the main thing they have left, in a few cases this was more prevalent, much more prevalent in BFA. They had Control Undead, they could steal some beneficial mobs here and there, but nowadays the more important thing is going to be grip, being able to grip mobs. That's more or less the more important one they can have, as well as the only real advantage over Havoc and Windwalker, combat res. They do have a combat res unlike the other two, which is only really valuable in Mythic Plus. Now, at the end of this competition, knowing what we know, knowing that Havoc is significantly ahead when it comes to both single target and lower targets consistent damage and sustained damage, and that in the opposite case it's Windwalker who is further ahead than Havoc, knowing what we know about the utility and the mobility available to all three specs, putting again Havoc in front of everyone, followed closely this time by Windwalker and further behind by Frost Death Knight. The winner of this face-off is going to be Havoc Demon Hunter. The seed number 2 of the melee DPS respects and maintains the expectation of passing the first round quite handily. Windwalker gave them a good run. Windwalker has been doing nicely. I don't think even the most faithful Windwalker monks back in 9.0.5, when Windwalker was getting hotfixed, TLDR, nerfed, they could have thought Windwalker would have remained this relevant in this tier. Windwalker right now is amongst the better performers in Mythic raids when it comes to melee DPS, and also one of the better performers in Mythic Plus when it comes to melee DPS. So they are certainly still doing just fine. They do have, as we have just seen, an extremely powerful niche when it comes to damage profile, which is AoE, or rather burst AoE. Very quick bursts of damage, which are very useful on fights like Soul Render, on fights like Painsmith. It will be useful on Kel'Thuzad, and even on Fate Scribe, and even on Sylvanas. So in the later stages of this tier, when it comes to boss fights, Windwalker has a lot of value that they're going to be able to get from the damage in the raid. Yes, of course, nobody is going to deny that the AoE damage you can get in Painsmith, the AoE damage you can get in Fate Scribe, and partially, mostly, the AoE damage you can get on Kel'Thuzad, and even the AoE you will get on Sylvanas, will be enough to put you at the top of the meters and show you in the overall performance, in the overall logs quite highly. But at the same time, in none of these fights, the AoE of those situations is the most important one, is the crucial one. It's kind of double-faced. It's not really, truly that important, but it will keep up with the appearances. People will get baited into believing they are doing super well, which I don't think too many people will complain about. So they will be able to maintain their role as a very, very good DPS spec. And then, conversely, we do have Havoc, which completely changed face. Now they are a much stronger single target and cleave, low target focused spec, while still being able to maintain serviceable / decent AoE damage. Being lower than a Windwalker monk in AoE is not really the testament of being a bad AoE spec. You know, Havoc Demon Hunter can still pull 15,000 DPS on Soul Render. You know, a bad AoE spec on Soul Render would be doing 10,000 DPS, which is exactly what Feral Druids are doing on Soul Render. That is a bad AoE spec, certainly not Havoc. They're not the best anymore. That doesn't mean they're not good, though. So, after this first face-off between these three specs, the next that will be coming will be in a different bracket, because we will be moving over the ranged DPS bracket. After that, we are likely going to move on the special needs bracket of the healers, and then back to the melee DPS. Now, with this, we can leave, we can stop, and take a break. Thank you guys for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, remember to do the same things I've already said before. Thank you guys anyways. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I might have to start putting out odds for the winner of each round. Maybe it's gonna be profitable.